Oh, really? Oh, okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this edition of Policy Matters, a weekly panel and discussion series on public policy issues of importance in Canada and internationally, hosted by the McKechnie Institute. Welcome also to those of you who are live streaming with us. My name is Ian Stewart. I'm a professor in History and Philosophy of Science and Technology at the University of King's College, next door to Dalhousie, and I'm happy to be here to serve as chair of today's event. Today's topic, risk, resilience, and critical infrastructure, is a very complex one, requiring multidisciplinary perspectives. So it is fitting that in our considerations, we will be guided today by an engineer, a political scientist, and a public administration scholar. I will introduce them individually before they speak, but what they all have in common from different scholarly perspectives is the complex field of risk, its assessment, its management, and the systems and institutions of governance at various levels that serve to protect the public, the environment, and our social and economic interests in the face of emergencies that can arise either by natural or human origin. Today's focus is the just released book by today's first speaker, Dr. Kevin Quigley, a person known to most of us here. Dr. Quigley is, of course, the scholarly director of the McKechnie Institute for Public Policy and Governance and a professor in the School of Public Administration here at Dalhousie University. He specializes in public sector risk and crisis management, strategic management, and critical infrastructure protection. Dr. Quigley's new book, as I said, will be the subject of today's panel. Too Critical to Fail: How Canada Manages Threats to Critical Infrastructure, just released a few days ago. Dr. Quigley is too modest. Dr. Quigley is too modest and too professional to want to use today's event as a book launch, but I think this is such an important book. That I've used my prerogative as chair to insist that some copies be brought along for immediate purchase, and you can find them outside the lecture hall. In a moment, Dr. Quigley is going to introduce that book to us for about 20 minutes or 25, followed by remarks by our two other panel members, Dr. Ron Pelot from Dalhousie's Faculty of Engineering, and Dr. Dan Henstra of University of Waterloo's Department of Political Science. For the last 25 minutes or so, we'll open up the room for questions, as usual, from the floor and from those joining us also from live stream. Let me take a minute to say why this book is so important from my perspective, the field of history and philosophy of science and technology. Black swan events are the focus of Too Critical to Fail. Events characterized by being rare, hard to predict, but having potentially a massive and even destructive consequence. Black swan events were made famous by Nassim Taleb's book by that title, The Black Swan: The Impact of the Highly Improbable, published in 2007. Amongst its various hard-hitting messages, Taleb's book was a frontal attack on the various forms, as he saw it, of overweening pride, unsubstantiated confidence, and dangerously high levels of intellectual laziness by experts working in the field of statistics and their applications in economics, but also science, technology, and engineering fields, as well as government departments responsible for harnessing that expertise for the public good. The book was as hugely contentious as it has been successful. For historians and philosophers of science and technology like me, understanding the limits of knowledge, what we don't know and why, is as necessary for understanding modern science and technology and the societies based on them as the opposite, what we know or think we know and why. But it's very rare that folks in my field deal with the realities of governance systems and institutions that put science and technology knowledge into play and deal with the realities of the fallout and chaos that black swan events introduce to the body politic. In their book, Too Critical to Fail, Dr. Quigley and his co-authors, Bisset and Bryan Mills, have offered a tour de force consideration of black swan events from a public administration perspective. While they do not share Professor Taleb's iconoclasm, They have brought, from my point of view, deep questions about how we administer human knowing and not knowing into the realm of the concrete. By asking how are we doing in Canada when it comes to the critical infrastructure meant to prevent and manage black swan events. Lately, I've been deeply immersed in the science and technology policy as it relates to oil and gas sector, especially oil spill response planning and management. And I have benefited enormously from reading Too Critical to Fail, even though they don't touch on that area. With a deep grounding in theoretical frameworks in risk governance and Canadian politics, Kevin and his co-authors look at detailed cases, recent cases, where human livelihoods and sometimes human lives were tragically at stake. Their book, in my view, represents the best kind of policy-relevant scholarship that academia has to offer, precise analysis, and where necessary, courageous critique. I think you'll see what I mean as Kevin takes the podium now for the next 25 minutes to introduce his book. Join me in welcoming Dr. Kevin Quigley.
Thanks, Ian, for that very kind introduction. Not too much pressure there. I want to thank Ian for chairing today. It was good of you to accept our invitation. I also want to thank Professor Ron Pelot and Professor Dan Henstra for contributing to today's discussion. I'm thanking them in advance because I don't know what they're going to say about the book in the second half. And as Oscar Wilde once said, true friends stab you in the front. So knowing that that's always a possibility, I thought I'd better say my thank yous now. I want to acknowledge also the keen scholarship and support of my co-authors, Ben Bisset and Bryan Mills. Ben and Bryan were both MPA students many years ago, but it takes a long time to get a book done, and they stuck with it. And I thank them for it, their hard work and their scholarship, and I'm grateful that we were able to see it to its conclusion. Ben is in British Columbia today, and Bryan is in New Brunswick, both working away. Bryan's now a practicing lawyer, and Ben works in the public service. There are other co-authors to thank. Colin MacDonald is a co-author in one of the chapters, and so is Kristen Stollard. They were also both graduate students in the MPA program, and that's how I got to know them. And John Quigley and Calvin Burns, and you met Calvin, of course, here a couple of weeks ago talking about water. They're also co-authors in different chapters. So it's a very collaborative sort of exercise writing a book. One can't take sole responsibility for it by any means. I'd also like to thank Janet Lord, who was the copy editor of the book. Janet worked very tirelessly for several years, several iterations of this manuscript before it actually completed, and her sharp eye was extremely helpful. I'll also mention that we received funding from the Social Science and Humanities Research Council at different points in time, the Centre for Security Science, and Public Safety Canada. Without their support, we couldn't have gotten this work done, but of course the opinions and the research are the responsibility of the authors alone. The presentation I'm about to make really just is a sort of picking and choosing some highlights from what was a really extensive piece of work that took several years to complete. So it's just a highlights piece, but you know, the book is out just in time for Christmas. Don't wait for the movie. That might be, if it took 10 years to write the book, God only knows how long it'll take us to do the movie. Anyway, it's just going to be a little sort of pick and choose of highlights. I want to talk about the framework. I want to talk about some of the cases. I want to talk about some of our principal observations. So on that note, and I think my time should only start at this point. On May 13th, 2014, while he worked with his young son on his boat in the backyard, Thomas Harding was surrounded by a SWAT team, sirens wailing, and led away in handcuffs. Later that day, he and two colleagues, Jean Demaitre and Richard Labrie, were marched into a makeshift courtroom in full view of the press. They were charged with 47 counts of criminal negligence causing death. The temporary courthouse was in Lac-Mégantic, a town most people had never heard of before the early hours of July 6, 2013, when the brakes failed on an unattended freight train carrying 7.7 million liters of petroleum in the form of crude oil. As we know, 47 people died, 2,000 more were evacuated, and the downtown core was destroyed. It was the deadliest rail disaster in Canada since Confederation. In its report on the incident, published 3 months after Mr. Harding appeared in court, the Transportation Safety Board pointed to 18 distinct causes and contributing factors, including 3 that pointed at the regulator Transport Canada in particular. 25 different organizations were accused of sharing responsibility for the derailment, and they contributed approximately $450 million for an out-of-court settlement fund for the victims. At virtually the same time as the flames ripped through Lac-Mégantic, on the other side of the country, a good portion of the Canadian province of Alberta sat underwater. Between June 19th and July 12, 2013, heavy rainfall triggered the worst flooding in Alberta's history, which washed across nearly 1/4 of the province. 5 people died as a result of the floods, and over 100,000 were forced to leave their homes. 30 communities declared local states of emergency. The province declared its first ever state of emergency. Nearly 14,500 homes were damaged, and 80 schools and 10 health facilities were affected. Most estimates put the final cost of the flood in excess of $6 billion, which at the time made it the costliest disaster in Canadian history. The findings of the flood post-mortem were largely positive. The report concluded the extensive emergency management skills, capability, and legislation exist within the province. Polls suggested people felt very positive about the role of the public servants in the flood response, with 82% of Albertans describing the work done by emergency responders as excellent, and a further 12% describing it as good. The UK newspaper The Guardian noted that the mayor of Calgary, Naheed Nenshi, emerged from the crisis with a folk hero status, with friendly vandals taping his face onto Superman posters. Of the $6 billion in losses caused by the flood, only $2 billion was covered by insurance. As a result, the Alberta government announced that its disaster recovery programs would cover $3.1 billion in uninsurable loss and damage suffered by the individuals, small businesses, municipalities, and other groups. Ultimately, the program funded a number of losses that were beyond the program's original scope. So we might classify both of these events, the Lac-Mégantic derailment and the Alberta floods, as black swans, which are low probability, high consequence disasters with elements of randomness and bad luck. Yet the juxtaposition of these two cases raises important questions about the manner in which we prepare for and respond to disasters in our communities. Despite the fact that the Alberta floods cost 13 times more than the train derailment in Lac-Mégantic, why was there 3 times more media coverage of the train derailment than of the floods? Given both events were devastating and costly, what explains the negative assessment of key actors and processes in the media coverage and audits after the Lac-Mégantic derailment, but the relatively positive assessment of actors and processes after the Alberta floods? Why in Lac-Mégantic were some held to account in a specific, intense, and public manner, while others implicated in the derailment remained largely anonymous and silent? While the post-mortem in Alberta was largely positive and some actors were celebrated, why were town planners not held to account for planning decisions that exposed communities to such devastating natural disasters? The comparison between Lac-Mégantic derailment and the Alberta floods highlights an important dimension of such disasters. However random they may seem, disasters occur in a particular social, cultural, popular, geographic, legal, and market context, which influences the likelihood and consequences of these events and contributes to the manner in which we interpret, respond to, and apportion blame for them. So between 2011 and 2014, we interviewed 68 officials for our research. We focused largely on the transportation and dangerous chemical sector. We examined media coverage of 40 different post-9/11 disasters. We included natural disasters, industrial failures, terrorist attacks, terrorist plots, pandemics, and cyber events. We used the Hood-Rothstein-Baldwin risk regulation regimes framework to structure the analysis. Hood and colleagues use a cybernetic understanding of control to explain government responses to risk. They examine how the regime gathers information, sets standards, and changes behavior. The authors hypothesize that context shapes the manner in which risk is regulated. They test 3 separate but overlapping hypotheses as a way of examining context: a market failure hypothesis, an opinion-responsive hypothesis, and an interest group hypothesis. We will examine each of these 3 pressures in turn. So what is critical infrastructure? Canada's National Strategy for Critical Infrastructure defines CI as processes, systems, facilities, technologies, networks, assets, and services essential to the health, safety, security, or economic well-being of Canadians and the effective functioning of government. In Canada, there are 10 CI sectors: health, food, finance, water, information and communication technology, safety, which usually refers to emergency services, energy and utilities, manufacturing, government, and transportation. Canada's National Strategy and Action Plan note that high-impact, low-frequency events, such as black swans, are rare but devastating and require special attention because of the potential for massive loss should they occur. The National Strategy for CI in Canada has 3 strategic objectives: build partnerships, implement an all-hazards risk management approach, and advance the timely sharing and protection of information among partners. The initiative emphasizes trust building, collaborative risk management, and information sharing among CI owners and operators to facilitate lesson learning and best practices. According to our research, the primary focus of risk regulation efforts in CI appears to be the gathering of information. Governments have made large investments in information gathering mechanisms, and private sector CI operators are often subject to reporting requirements, sometimes mandatory, sometimes voluntary. Standard setting or rule setting, the second component of the control mechanism, is characterized by a mix of fixed and flexible standards. Generally in CI, there's a preference for flexibility and compromise over conventional command and control instruments. Under this model, governments set broad guidelines and disseminate best practices, which are interpreted and applied by industry associations or individual firms in the manner best suited to their circumstances. Behavior change represents the smallest component of the regime. We heard from many interview participants that governments dedicate relatively fewer resources to legislative and regulatory enforcement. Conducting inspections, applying penalties, prosecuting lawbreakers, these activities demand significant resources and large bureaucracies. So what context explains this regulatory regime? Let's turn our attention to the 3 contextual pressures: markets, public opinion, and organized interests. We'll start with markets. Most CI is owned and operated by the private sector. Government strategies typically assume a partnership with industry. They typically create fora in which CI owners and operators can share information with each other and with government. Despite the government's emphasis on trust building in these fora, it's not clear that trust is clearly defined. Are we talking about trust in people, trust in process, trust in outcomes, trust in roles and responsibilities, trust in institutions? It's not clear. If you can't define it, how would you know if you can achieve it? They assume a degree of goodwill by those who participate in these CI fora, but it is not clear that goodwill is necessarily present among participating organizations. Information in market context does not flow freely. There are numerous reasons to withhold information about vulnerabilities, about the critical infrastructure upon which your organization depends. Organizations are often concerned about their security, their liability, their share value, and their public image, just to name a few. A healthy skepticism towards CI owners and operators might at times serve as better than trust. Finally, is trust even desirable in all instances? Governments and industry typically have robust and urgent responses following a disaster, but the impetus to act prior to an event is not the same. Prior to 9/11, for example, many security experts warned of an extraordinary attack by air. Our failure to imagine and visualize such an event, what psychologists refer to as the availability heuristic, as well as the costs involved in building up security for what seems like an unlikely event, often prevents us from acting. Next point, the law and insurance. The law and insurance are 2 important market regulators but their impact is constrained in critical infrastructure protection and big bang disasters. Rare events are notoriously difficult to insure against because there are insufficient data for insurance companies to develop sustainable policies. As J. David Cummins emphasizes, quote, catastrophic events, and particularly mega catastrophes such as Katrina and the World Trade Center terrorist attack, violate to some degree nearly all of the standard conditions for insurability. Insurance after these events usually requires heavy subsidies. The legal process is slow due to the complexity of the systems. We note several examples in the book of processes taking years and sometimes decades to resolve, from the Exxon Valdez disaster to the Air India bombing to the Sunrise propane explosion in Toronto. Markets also react to laws, and not always in an anticipated way. In 2004, the federal government implemented changes to the criminal code that affected how corporations are held accountable after their actions. Bill C-45, the so-called Westray Bill, named after the Nova Scotia mining disaster, extended the criminal liability of corporations in the field of health and safety. It is no longer necessary to prove criminal intent when prosecuting companies for offenses such as criminal negligence. The absence of claims under the Westray legislation, however, raises questions about the effectiveness of its provisions. Researchers have noted a new consulting market in Canada in which lawyers and occupational safety experts advise companies on how to avoid responsibility under the Westray legislation. The difficulty in finding someone responsible for these failures under the law is another challenge. Earlier this year, Supreme Court Justice Edward Gatto found former engineer Edward Wood not guilty of criminal charges for his role in the parking lot collapse at the Algo Mall in Elliott Lake, Ontario, which killed 2 people and injured 19. In his decision, Justice Gatto described Wood as having carried out inspections in a shoddy, sloppy, and inadequate manner. Gatto concluded that he was troubled by his own verdict and noted that Wood should accept moral responsibility for what occurred, a concept that is vague and unenforceable. Overall, we found the market failure hypothesis is only partially applicable to the CI sectors we examined. The existing market mechanisms in place to manage these risks are only partly effective and in some cases slow and weak. If the regime reflected the market failure hypothesis, we'd like to see more aggression in regulating the risk, particularly in adherence to standards and behavior change. The opinion-responsive hypothesis directs our attention to the correlation between regime content and public preferences and attitudes. According to this hypothesis, regulatory efforts will focus on the risks of most concern to citizens. Studying the validity of this argument requires measuring public concern, which can be done in various ways, and none are without controversy. Like Hood and colleagues, we use public polling and media coverage as barometers of public opinion. And so we'll start with media coverage, and I'll just direct your attention to the slides. I want to just point out a visual we have in the book. We have a database that has the 40 different critical infrastructure disasters that occurred, all post 9/11. We examined the media coverage from a number of different angles and perspectives. I want to just talk about 2 today, though. We looked at the Globe and Mail's coverage of Canadian events, New York Times coverage of American events, the Daily Telegraph's coverage of UK events, and the Australians' coverage of Australian events. Most of the events are Canadian, but there are some events, comparable events from different countries. We picked the broadsheets because they're highly distributed broadsheets in each country, even if ideologically the broadsheets are a little different. Okay, obviously the Daily Telegraph is different from the Globe and Mail, but the Daily Telegraph is the most read broadsheet in the UK, so that's why we picked the Daily Telegraph. Okay, New York Times is not the most read broadsheet in the US. The Financial Times is, or pardon me, the Wall Street Journal is, but we thought that was sort of a comparable paper and a reasonable compromise, so we picked New York Times for the US events. So we counted the number of articles that appeared in the newspaper for 365 days following the start of the event, and that's what's captured on this vertical line, the volume of media coverage. And then we did a second line, which looked at how government agencies were depicted in that coverage. Were they depicted positively, negatively, neutrally? Okay? So the vertical line captures the number of articles. The horizontal line captures the tone of the coverage or the criticism of the government. So obviously, if you're on the right-hand side, it's positive assessment of government, and on the left-hand side, it's negative assessment of government. And what we found in the coverage was patterns to the kinds of events, or the kind of media coverage that one gets, and I'll just put that up now. I'll also point out that the extreme outliers, like Magnetique, for instance, where there were hundreds and hundreds of articles, they are not part of this sample, but the patterns were similar. But the ones like pandemics as well, top left-hand corner, H1N1 got tons and tons of media coverage, so I can talk to you a little bit about that later during Q&A if you want. But this was the general tone of the coverage. Natural disasters receive high-volume coverage and positive assessments of government. Terrorist plots also a little less, but positive assessment of government. After all, they foiled the plot. So when we're talking about terrorist plot, we're talking about that's been foiled, right? Like Sydney 5, Toronto 18, that sort of stuff. BA transatlantic flight, for example. Terrorist attacks are ones that are actually carried out. They generate a high volume of coverage, as you can see. And it's just tipping a little bit towards the negative because government's in a slightly more chaotic kind of form. But still, high volume coverage, a little bit negative, but not too bad. But much more positive coverage on failed terrorist plots where the governments have actually foiled the plot, but again, much lower volume. Industrial failures almost without question. A ruthless hunt for accountability. Very, very negative, almost entirely negative coverage of industrial failures. And little old cyber attacks, nobody cares. Nobody's really that interested in cyber. And I want to come back to that a little bit later. So these are the general patterns. The only one area where I might say there's a little bit of an exception to this is natural disasters. The natural disasters could move into the negative. There were times when they did. We did look at the 2007 UK floods. That was negative, but we thought that was maybe a little bit of an outlier for the general tone of a lot of the media coverage for natural disasters. So this has implications in terms of the way people think about accountability and how well government's doing. during these events. And of course, with natural disasters, you can understand why there's lots of positive coverage, because emergency services out there doing their best, putting the sandbags in, blocking the water, getting the cats on the tree, helping the old ladies, that sort of stuff. That's the kind of coverage that we get, but we probably don't get very sort of systematic review and analytical review, a lot of the preparation for natural disasters, and particularly coverage around the things that happened before these natural disasters occurred. Okay? Industrial failures tend to be a little bit ruthless, but maybe a little less systematic in its review of the industrial context. Okay, some polling data. What's the most important problem facing Canadians today? So it's a little bit up and down, but I'll just point out security is very, very rarely of interest to Canadians. There was a peak on September 11th, around 2001, 2002. About 20% of Canadians thought that was the number one issue. But then it dropped down to virtually nothing, and it stayed at virtually nothing except for a little blip in 2006 when it stepped up about 1 or 2 percentage points. But not really all that of much concern. But what you do, when you add economy, healthcare, and unemployment together, you get that line, which really dominates what most Canadians think is the number one priority. So largely economy, healthcare, and unemployment, not so much security. I'll just go back and point out the environment occasionally gets a little bit of interest. It peaked in 2007 with 15%, but generally pretty low as well. Okay, so do you trust the government to do what is right? Canada, a little bit higher than some of its allies, actually, the same as Australia and the UK, but or pardon me, a little higher than the UK and the US, but still not so low, not so high. And generally, this number has been trending downward for the last 20, 30 years. Do you trust the government? The peak of this answer would have been in the 60s in the US when they started monitoring these questions. Around 80% of Americans would have said that they trust the government to do the right thing. Now, under Barack Obama, I think it bottomed out at about 19 or 20% of Americans saying they trust the government to do the right thing. So there is a downward trend in people's trust of government. So Canada's around the middle. This is from the Edelman Trust, a particular subgroup of the population, and consistently around 50% over the last few years. But what about critical infrastructure and who's managing the critical sectors? And so what you see, if you were to ask Canadians, do you trust industry, the number is slightly higher than their trust of government, but not much higher. It's a very similar sort of number. But if you actually drill down by sector, actually you get a different kind of response. So there are some sectors that are quite unpopular, like financial services and banks are at the bottom. Also oil, not particularly popular. Renewables does quite well. Fracking, not so good. Food and beverage, pretty good. Technology, though, I'll point out, is extremely high. Technology sector is extremely high. Also, family businesses and small and medium-sized enterprises are highly trusted. Between 2013 and 2015, 72% to 76% of respondents said they trusted them, 20% higher than large corporations. Much of the critical infrastructure owners and operators are large corporations. So, as with the market failure hypothesis, we saw mixed support in our evidence for the opinion-responsive explanation of regime content. Canadians are not particularly concerned about security, and therefore a regime that focuses largely on information gathering may be consistent with the opinion-responsive hypothesis. Still, there are some powerful tensions when we consider this hypothesis. First, media coverage follows different narratives depending on the type of event. For example, accountability after an industrial failure tends to be focused narrowly, whereas accountability after a natural disaster tends to be elusive and often forgiving. Secondly, polling data suggests Canadians have middling levels of trust for government and that large industry in particular that owns, operates CI, and that trust is trending downward. In order to meet the expectations of the opinion-responsive hypothesis, we would expect the government to be more aggressive on standards and behavior change and a more transparent stance with the public in order to increase trust, as the trust literature would suggest. But we found, at best, mixed evidence of this. Finally, people trust tech and small companies more, but these organizations ironically seem to embody more unchecked risk. Family businesses and small and medium-sized enterprises, for example, are highly trusted, yet these firms are less likely to hold insurance, have risk management expertise, or have redundant systems in place to cope with these failures. The public trusts the technology sector the most, and by a good measure. Most people do not worry about online security, but risk experts do. In the Society of Actuaries 2014 Annual Survey of Emerging Risks, 58% of experts identified cybersecurity and interconnected infrastructure as the #1 emerging risk concern, passing climate change concerns for the first time since the survey started. We argued that the interest group hypothesis offers a strong explanation for the features we observed in the chemical and transportation regimes. Specifically, we saw a high degree of alignment between industry preferences and government preferences in subsectors where firms are represented by well-organized and well-funded industry associations, or where there are only a small number of non-competitive operators and fewer regulators. These arrangements are often viewed in negative terms as a form of regulatory capture, meaning the government simply implements the priorities of the most influential interest group. Our evidence, however, offers a less pessimistic take on the implication of client politics. As underscored by the governance literature, expertise and capacity are no longer located solely or even primarily in government bureaucracies. By maintaining close relationships with the chemical and transportation companies, regulators can access and leverage the technical knowledge possessed by industry officials. Regulators at the federal level are also able to influence industry behavior in areas under provincial jurisdiction, enabling a higher degree of uniformity to be established across the regime. Still, such a close relationship and interdependence leaves questions about transparency and accountability. So with respect to accountability, Peters refers to three types: answerability, which refers to rendering an account; responsibility, which refers to following ethical standards in the law; and responsiveness, which refers to responding to the needs of the public. At times, these concepts overlap. So I'm going to discuss these three types of accountability in reference to rail safety, particularly around the time of the Lac-Mégantic disaster and the audits that followed. These are in some ways extreme examples, but as organizational anthropologists point out, it's in extreme conditions that we see how the system works. And as noted, the CI literature, including the government's national strategy, underscores the importance of extreme cases. So I'd like to show you a quotation from an interview between the CBC and the Minister of Transport following the publication of the Auditor General's 2013 report on rail safety oversight. The audit itself was carried out just before the Lac-Mégantic rail disaster and published a few months after it. In the excerpt, the minister, for the most part, refers to the elected government, including herself, as we, as distinct from Transport Canada, they. She notes the determined effort the elected government has made to support increased audits and the safety management system, such as, quote, we provided to the department in 2009 extra funding, end quote. Despite the fact that the elected government had been in power for over 5 years, she attributes the failings to Transport Canada alone. In the second part of the interview, however, when she emphasizes progress and achievements, she includes the elected government as integral to government operations. Quote, we will implement the plan, and quote, we have actually increased the number of inspections. So to read that line, why were only 1 in 4 safety management audits completed from 2009 to 2013? The reply, well, that's what I asked Transport Canada officials myself when the results of the audit were becoming apparent. You know, we provided the department in 2009 extra funding to deal with more inspections, to deal with rail safety, and we based it on the fact that we had a very good independent panel tell us about rail safety in Canada in 2007. So for us, we had fully anticipated and expected that not only is Transport Canada doing the compliance work that they should be doing with the Rail Safety Act, but as well that they should be working on safety management system regulations too, and today we found from the Auditor General that that's not the case. We have his recommendations, we accept them, and Transport Canada has provided a plan, and we will implement that plan. All right, but the question here is, does Transport Canada need more inspectors after the Auditor General found that it only completed a quarter of its planned audits in the safety management system? What's the plan? Is it more inspectors? Minister of Transport, the plan is, if you take a look at the plan set out today, the Transport Canada has indicated the path forward. They have to figure out how many resources they need to pull into the safety management system audit side of it. We have increased inspectors, though, Evan. We have actually increased the number of inspectors last year to 30,000, highest year ever. So they're out there doing their work on rail safety and ensuring that companies are adhering to the regulations that we passed. On the audit side, though, they're not completing audits. It's not acceptable. And as I indicated to them, we all agree this is not what Canadians expect. The minister seems to place the responsibility with the department separate from the elected government. In 2015, the minister was given an opportunity to discuss accountability over rail safety in the department, and this is what she said. You use the word failings. Has there been any accountability within Transport Canada? Has anybody lost their job over the way things were or were not enforced at MMA? Reply, if you take a look at the current listing of people who are in Transport Canada, you see there's a marked difference in the people who were in Transport Canada pre-2013. A lot of it was natural turnover. There was a lot of retirements happening, and the management of the department lies with the deputy minister, and I think he's done an excellent job of making sure that we have the right group and the right mix of people going forward. I think the department's in a really good place to make sure that the lessons we need to learn from Lac-Mégantic, from the derailments, from the auditor's report are going to be implemented, and I have great confidence that they will. But were those changes around accountability? Anybody moved in or out because of the way things were or were not? I leave it to the deputy minister to make his assessment of who needs to be in a position, and changes were made. It's difficult to decipher if people lost their jobs, and if they did, whether it was because of negligence or retirement or natural turnover. She alludes to all of these possibilities without being clear about either. She makes no reference to any process of holding people to account. She's also unclear about why the minister is comfortable with the new arrangement. This type of response existed for the minister partly because of the opaque nature of ministerial responsibility. This somewhat nebulous concept has long been the subject of great interest to politicians and public administration scholars. During the time of the last administration, the concept continued to be a moving target, as Max Paris described. The 2007 Guide for Ministers, written by the PCO, explained ministerial responsibility this way. Quote, ministers are individually responsible to Parliament and the Prime Minister for their own actions and those of their department, including the actions of all officials under their management and direction, whether or not the minister had prior knowledge. By 2011, there had been a shift in thinking, emphasizing what it is not. Ministerial accountability to Parliament does not mean that a minister is presumed to have knowledge of every matter that occurs within his or her department or portfolio, nor that the minister is necessarily required to accept blame for every matter, wrote PCO in an updated version of the pamphlet. The definition includes enough ambiguity that ministers can deny responsibility for operational failures. The exchange demonstrates that there continues to be important limits on transparency and accountability at the political and the professional public service. In terms of Peter's second type of accountability, responsibility, the government seems to have done a lot, particularly in the aftermath of the event. Both the former government and present government noted that the government was not responsible for the events in Lac-Mégantic derailment, which is ironic at the very least, given the government's regulatory role before such events, the claims made in the audits about the government, the contributions to the out-of-court settlement, and the financial exposure to the government in the aftermath of such events. In fact, the government did respond to the event with a number of initiatives and paid a lot of money for these initiatives. Taken together, the episode raises questions about where responsibility actually lies for critical infrastructure safety oversight, whether public and private incentives are properly aligned for responsible decision-making, the different ways we hold people to account for these failures, and how accessible the information is to the public. With respect to responsiveness, how the government's response aligns with public expectations is more difficult to determine. There is no question that the public expects a rigorous form of review after an event like Lac-Mégantic, that victims should be recognized and compensated for their suffering, and that systems should be put in place to prevent similar incidents. Notwithstanding their concerns over safety, small communities argue to keep the trains coming to their communities because of their important economic value. There's still a high level of public resistance, particularly in Quebec, to pipelines, despite evidence to suggest that they have a better safety record than rail. And in the last federal election, Lac-Mégantic was hardly mentioned. In this sense, the public is implicated in the ambivalence. So, as the centenary of the Halifax explosion approaches, what might we say about our exposure to potentially catastrophic events and our ability to respond effectively to them? Our CI depends on complex and intricate systems in which ownership and responsibility are highly diffuse and often operate in a competitive context in which there are strong industry interests. Government seeks to be relevant in the regime but not responsible. It encourages the exchange of information, enforces standards, sometimes mandatory, sometimes voluntary. It is at times a lighter touch approach when it comes to changing behavior. Many of the formal accountability systems in public institutions are often slow, selective, and at times opaque. The informal ones, such as the popular press, can be reactive and misguided. In our view, these types of events should lead to more independent audits, more transparency, more thoughtful and sustained public engagement. Of the events we looked at, some had powerful after-the-fact accounts and independent audits. Some did not. We should also strengthen our focus on how we balance efficiency with safety and critical infrastructure, and how we construct and maintain a realistic and enforceable accountability structure in this complex context, one that is ethical and one that we can all trust. In this sense, the government's focus on developing trust with CI owners and operators is somewhat misplaced. While we can focus on the importance of keeping some information confidential for competitive or security reasons, government should be equally, if not more, concerned about building trust with the citizenry, a group that is largely overlooked in the government's CI strategy. Government has a regulatory and formal leadership role to play. Its role is qualitatively different from the private sector. By sitting at a table as a partner, as government often describes itself, government potentially compromises its ability to play the role of enforcer and loses sight of its accountability to the public. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
So we're going to move now to the panel's comments. That's you, yeah. And so first we're going to call on Professor Ron Pelot, who's been a professor in industrial engineering at Dalhousie since 1994. His main research area is in marine activity modeling, incident risk analysis, and emergency response planning. And since 2012, Dr. Pelot has also served as the Associate Scientific Director of the MEOPAR Network of Centers of Excellence, and MEOPAR stands for the Marine Environmental Observation, Prediction, and Response. Ron.
Thank you. So as Dr. Quigley has pointed out quite often throughout the book, framing of the questions, the nature of the risk, which sector you're looking at, which government entities or private entities you're looking at, very much determines where the focus is on the risk management. So it behooves me to point out that my frame of reference is as a rational actor modeler, which means that I come from the engineering scientific point of view, where you say, well, if there are risks out there, how likely are they to happen? And if they happen, how bad could they be? Multiple kind of consequences. That's a standard kind of rational actor approach. And many researchers in the last few decades especially, and many of whom that Dr. Quigley refers to in the book, broaden this to say, well, okay, rational actor is good for some things, very good for repeated, regular risks, what they call simple risks, maybe even complex risks. But when you get beyond that, and even within those, there's a question of, well, what risks do people perceive? What are their values they put on the risks? What are the cultural, organizational things around trying to manage the risks? And this is very eye-opening for many risk practitioners. So I've read, of course, some of Dr. Quigley's work before and some related articles. The great advantage of this book is it puts a large number of concepts together to really bring to the forefront how the risk landscape is so complicated. It is very complicated, and you really have to understand it in terms of the different natures of the risk and the interplay between sectors and the different possible governance arrangements. So I think it's, if nothing else, especially an educational tome. I really think it should be at universities. Kevin and I know there aren't that many programs in the country that actually teach risk management and for government players. So I know I'm not here to sell a book. I'm just saying it's very educational because there's so many different models in there. So that being said, I could only cherry pick a few particular things I found interesting or a few questions I had to highlight a few points because there is so much information in there. So one point that I don't think Kevin had time to point out in his brief overview is a question of to what degree can humans manage risks anyways? So there are these models about high reliability organizations and normal accident theory, kind of opposing points of view, one of which HRO says you keep understanding, measuring, managing, putting in redundancies, training people, and eventually we'll get a lot of it under control. And normal accident theory says, yeah, right. It just says things are always going to go wrong. I have a sticker on my door in my office in engineering saying uncertainty happens. Everybody reads it, everybody likes it, nobody knows what it means. But what it means is, you never know what's going to happen. And so we are, compared to decades ago, getting a better handle on what is risk and how to think about it. But Kevin's book really shows that it is exceedingly complex to even figure out how to grasp it, right? Even how to grasp the concepts of, okay, some risks have been going down, accidents have been going down, medical risks are going down, health risks are better under control. And yes, the book is focused a lot on these extreme events and black swans. But there are a lot of other things that go wrong every day and it says, well, why didn't so-and-so or why didn't this agency kind of deal with this? It was either obvious if it's a regular thing or not obvious if it's a more extreme thing. So then you get into, okay, what are the governance aspects? Who is responsible? Who's supposed to be doing what? Why aren't people collaborating? Why aren't agencies collaborating? And a lot of that is covered in the book. So 30 years ago when I was studying at Waterloo, there were regular seminars on risk by the Institute for Risk Research. And at that time, the professors in those seminars were saying, risk is really coming into its own now. It's a relatively new concept and it's growing exponentially. That was 30 years ago. And if you look at any news, I know newspapers don't really exist anymore, but if you look at any newspaper, news article, it's really hard to get past 2 or 3 articles without finding the word risk. So now governments have it in their plans. Most companies have it as business continuity plans. And so this is Hood's framework and Wren's framework and the international governance of risk. And Kevin's book puts a lot of these together, are really saying, okay, we're getting to a point where, we can model it better, we have plans, but is it really doing the best we can as humans to manage these things? And he's pointing out there are a lot of weaknesses. And some of them maybe are inevitable. Things will always go wrong, but a lot of them could be managed much better, as he pointed out. I'll point out that risk analysis is also full of paradoxes, which is one of the difficulties we have in moving forward the risk agenda. One of the paradoxes is that risk analysis, risk assessment exposes weaknesses in systems and then obviously can engender blame. Do the doctors really want somebody checking through all the films of all the operations to figure out how many sponges they lost somewhere along the way? Well, if they did, maybe there's less chance of losing sponges. On the other hand, we're going to see who's dropping sponges when they shouldn't be, right? So there's a very important paradox here that even though risk is difficult, we need these methods to get people thinking about it and moving forward and not ignoring the difficult parts of risk, right? Another paradox is that sort of what you call a standards-based approach to risk and a risk-based approach. And Kevin talks a lot about standards. Government should set standards or shouldn't. The point is, it's a paradox because you go have an organization say, well, financial organizations, engineering organizations, bridges, say, well, here's the minimum standards we need. And if you do this, 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 and then maintain it, and then check it, and train people, then we're managing the risk. And you know what? That is not managing the risk. That is the baseline. That is the floor for managing the risk. And above that, you actually have to have people aware of risk and watching for problems and being agile. And his methods also talk quite a bit about how you have to have good risk communication. You can just impose a whole bunch of standards on industry and then they're less competitive and it won't actually solve the problem. So you need the standards, but you certainly need better education, better engagement with the groups so you get everybody thinking, okay, really, do we really want a massive failure here? And if we don't, how can we accommodate these kind of situations? So I'm going to finish with a couple of kind of questions more than comments, I guess. Maybe it'll come up in our discussion afterwards. Is there room to improve critical infrastructure protection? Well, of course there is, especially from these extreme events. What is driving the government to improving it? That was one of the main theses in the book. It's anchored around black swan events, but the main question is, well, does the government have a role? Does industry have a role? So you've got another paradox, which isn't new, but it's another paradox. If the government does it top-down, imposes the regulations, which in some cases they should, like airport security, then there isn't really buy-in from industry, not even necessarily buy-in from the public. And yet if you devolve it to the industry and it's more collegial as it is in the chemical industry and some of the transportation industry, you want that discourse, you want the experts at the table, you want buy-in, and you want everybody moving forward together, and yet is the government now giving proper oversight? So can they play both the carrot and the stick? Can they do the carrot approach, we're all in this together, and all these incentives and the Hood framework to see what are the contexts and what are the control mechanisms? Are we working on this together, or does the government need more stepping back and saying, yeah, we're together, but you better behave or else, because then things aren't tight enough? So I know that's a very simplistic way of putting a lot of these arguments, but I think that was one of the main questions that was being posed in the book. So thank you very much. Some food for thought, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Ron. So our third panelist, second respondent is Professor Daniel Henstra, who's Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. And his research centers on public administration and public policy with a focus on emergency management, climate adaptation, and flood risk governance. Dr. Henstra investigates particularly multi-level policy processes, so provincial, federal, municipal governments, and the networked interrelationships between those officials and public servants and stakeholders and the public. And most relevant to this is an edited volume in 2013 by Professor Henstra called Multi-Level Governance and Emergency Management in Canadian Municipalities, so with a focus on the municipal in relation to the other levels of government. Professor Henstra.
Well, thanks very much for the opportunity to be part of the Policy Matters Speakers Series. I've seen all of the previous speakers, and I'm honored to be among part of this distinguished group. First, hearty congratulations to Dr. Quigley and Ben Bisset and Bryan Mills for completing this important work. It's certainly an original contribution. There's really nothing of its kind in Canada from what I can tell, and I've been waiting for something like this for a long time, and now it's here. It's unique in a number of ways. First of all, in dealing with the important subject matter. Critical infrastructure that sustains our lives is so easily overlooked. And when it is analyzed, it's often, the discussion is very technical. It's usually from an engineering lens, which is very important. But it's great to see also an analysis of this topic from the perspective of public administration and public policy. And throughout the book, the authors systematically weave many of the classic themes in public administration about interests. What are the interests of the various actors involved? How do they conflict? How can they be aligned? And so on. Accountability. Who is accountable for critical infrastructure protection? To whom is accountability owed? And by what mechanism can it be rendered? These sorts of questions are highly important when dealing with a subject so important as critical infrastructure. It's also hugely informative. I learned a lot, and I actually know probably more than most about critical infrastructure, but I learned a ton in this book. And it's really also an example of very good research. So for students, this is another reason to read it. Besides the subject matter, thorough and meticulous research. Each sub-point is clearly explained and resourced. The methods are clear and fully replicable. And throughout, there are acknowledgments of the limitations of the work, where this is warranted. So it's really refreshing to see this conscientious work. A couple of observations about the book. Critical infrastructure protection is a complex governance problem. This book is a clear illustration of the difficulty of grappling with complex problems of this type, where risk is shared by all in society, and there's clearly a public interest in mitigating this risk, but information and capacity is dispersed among a wide range of public and private sector actors. It's very difficult to coordinate their efforts towards a common goal. This type of governance structure is familiar to me from my own research on climate change adaptation, emergency management, and more recently flood risk management. And these types of complex policy issues, complex governance problems have a number of characteristics. First, there's no clear and present danger. Even though the risk is always there, there's little perceived urgency to defend against what is seen to be a fairly unlikely events. And I think in the case of chemical plants here, which is one of the regimes or one of the industries that's examined in this book, where an accident could have major consequences, but it's statistically unlikely, and so it's easy to sort of overlook this risk and focus on other things. Protecting against failure is a lower priority than other day-to-day operational things. There are many immediate competing demands on scarce resources. So there's an opportunity cost to spending on critical infrastructure protection because we could be doing other things with these resources. There's little business or political incentive to allocate resources to a state of continuous readiness. It's easy to overlook this. And in some cases, the investment in safety can put a critical infrastructure operator, a company, at a competitive disadvantage because others, typically smaller competitors, can so-called free ride on the investments of the larger players, and they can then, but at the same time, weaken the supply chain through their negligence. Or their neglect, I should say. Policy and governance in these areas is largely reactive. There's a greater focus on blame avoidance than on shared responsibility, where that is the critical part, sharing responsibility among the actors who either contribute to risk or have resources to mitigate the risk, but instead there's a focus on blame avoidance. And typically this is driven by media stories, where the questions quickly emerge. Who's to blame? How could this have been prevented and why wasn't it prevented? When in many cases it's difficult to anticipate these types of events and really no one is to blame. It's systemic. Government intervention typically happens only in the aftermath of a major failure, typically under pressure from the media and the public to do something about this problem. Right? So governments have to act quickly. So what we get is this punctuated pattern of event-driven policymaking, where there's pressure in the immediate aftermath of a disaster to quickly announce some new initiative or solution about how something is going to be solved in the future, without really taking the time to reflect on and think through the consequences, and any particular unintended consequences. And although these disasters provide a window of opportunity to push through new policies, in some cases it's actually the worst time to make decisions because we don't have time to really reflect on the consequences of our actions. A third characteristic of these complex policy problems is there's inconsistency across the regime, or across multiple regimes in this case. And the book really illustrates how there's wide variation in critical infrastructure protection activities and investments and the readiness across different sectors. The chemical industry, for example, has a well-organized industry-driven standard called responsible care. That is long established. Companies are part of this initiative, and it creates an attitude of thinking about safety, or a culture of safety that permeates through its operations. In other cases, but even there, plans are made but are not regularly exercised or updated. I'm thinking here of the Neptune plant in Quebec, where there was a plan in place, but it wasn't well executed or wasn't up to date and led to failure. A fourth characteristic is in these complex policy domains is fairly weak direction or limited direction from government. What I saw in this book, in the description of the evolution of critical infrastructure protection, its governance in Canada, was very familiar from what I've seen in emergency management, disaster risk reduction, climate adaptation, and so on. It starts with a federal, provincial, territorial working vision. Get together in a room and talk about some broad vision of a desired end state. What does critical infrastructure protection look like, or the others? Then we move to a national strategy where we set out general goals and objectives to be met over some usually ambiguous time frame. We may or may not move to an action plan, but then sets out specific deliverables of the partners, who has a role to play and who should be putting resources into place, how will we go about doing this. And then it may or may not move forward into a platform, which is sort of the institutionalized body that comes out of all of this work that sets up a collaboration forum to try to keep the issue on the agenda or in the clear and present of those who are responsible for it. Typically, we see a sectoral approach where each sector has a working group set up that consists of government and industry representatives, and they meet periodically, quarterly or a couple of times a year, to talk about this issue, and they go back to their organizations. They're sort of reinvigorated and bring it back, but often quickly drops back off the agenda in favor of other immediate priorities. It means that the role of government is that of facilitator, bringing actors to the table, seeding discussion, talking about ideas, rather than its role as enforcer. We have to remember that governments are uniquely positioned in society to be able to impose binding obligations on private actors through regulation. But in this case, as I've seen in many other complex policy fields, governments are reluctant to use regulation as an instrument of governance because despite, in this case, the apparent need to push critical infrastructure operators to protect the infrastructure under their domain. Why? Because there's resistance from the private operators who don't want to be under any kind of restrictions. There's a perception that regulations pose an onerous burden on industry, can stifle innovation, and might cost jobs, the key currency of politics. And I'm making a joke of that. That, of course, is true. It's important, but that's the ever-present attitude. Regulation is bad. A fifth characteristic, as I see in this book about critical infrastructure, as well as these other complex policy domains, is remarkably little public involvement. Most of the discussion is very elite and hidden from public view. Here we, in this case, have really important planning underway, where the impacts of a failure to plan or to exercise plans can sometimes be catastrophic. It has massive societal impacts, and yet citizens are totally unaware that any of this discussion is taking place at all, and really have no role to play or input to provide, even though it's their lives that would be disrupted from a major event or lost in the case of a catastrophic accident. So for these reasons, governing these types of complex problems is very difficult and cumbersome. One other observation I want to make is about the importance of formal and informal relationships. About a month ago, I met the lead emergency manager from London in the UK, who said that he has this operating motto that when he's talking to first responders, said the first time we should meet is not in the aftermath of a disaster. We have to get to know each other ahead of time, exercise together, get to know each other to ensure that we can have an effective response after disaster. And this kind of personal contact seems critically important in building trust and building working understandings against actors who have responsibilities. And this permeates throughout this book. But the problem is that this is really difficult to mandate or to teach, in fact. It's not a science. It's an intangible thing. It's about dealing with personal relationships. And so it's pretty difficult to pass on. It's also highly vulnerable to staff turnover, where relationships are built and working understandings are in place through exercises, and people move on to other jobs. This is natural. I read a statistic in the public service nowadays that people stay in their job from 3 to 5 years. It's not like it used to be where people are there for 10 or 15 years, right? So that causes problems, and it's difficult to pass on this trust and understanding, and difficult to replicate from one organization to another. So this, too, complements the governance of these complex problems like critical infrastructure protection. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to our discussion.
You want to? Okay, so Kevin has instructed me that we're going to go straight to questions rather than giving Kevin a chance to respond to his fearsome critics. So we're going to begin with 4 questions from students in the 5120 class from public administration, and we're going to begin with Mr. Abdou Kantal, who right there.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank Dr. Quigley and the 2 able panelists around. In the 19th century, governments and countries were particularly interested in securing their territorial waters, the sea. In the 20th century, governments have shifted to also emphasize on national security in the airspace. Just like from the sea level now to the airspace, and that has to do with the internet, the provision of information technology services. And we understand that there are public-private partnerships in place, the P3s, in terms of providing information technology services to the government. I would like to ask Dr. Quigley, I know if I have the chance to grab a copy of the book, I would be interested in looking at the strategies in place for government to mitigate some of the implications or threats to public security in terms of information. But I would like to ask what government is doing, or what strategies government have in place, the Canadian government, to deal with the implications of having to contract out cyber-related tasks to private sectors. Because in the end, who takes the responsibility? I have just learned briefly from Professor Daniel that at some point there is reluctance from the side of private entities as to accepting the blame. And they don't also want too much of regulations or stiffer regulations from the government. So who takes the blame in this case? Because we're dealing with information, we're dealing with national security, we're dealing with policies, we're dealing with confidential information from the government. What strategies are in place to mitigate these implications or threats? Thank you.
So thank you for your question. It's a far-reaching one in many respects, and probably beyond my expertise to speak intelligently about the whole cyber domain. I will say that the Canadian government has a national cyber strategy. One thing that you've seen since the audit that occurred in, I think it was 2009, is that Public Safety Canada has been extremely busy because the audit wasn't particularly flattering. And since that time, the government has made a lot of effort to at least get some of the strategy documents that Dan referred to. That what goes on after the strategy, we'll see. But there is a cyber strategy. what we found in the cases that we looked at around cyber was, as I say, on the one hand, I mean, there's almost kind of echoes of September 11th to a certain extent, that you have security experts saying that we are potentially quite vulnerable on the cyber side, but it doesn't seem to resonate on the public side, partly because, as I say, media coverage doesn't really exist for a lot of cyber events. I've often joked that the CBC can only run so many stories in a darkened room with a light on somebody's hands typing away at a keyboard, where somebody somewhere is doing something, and they're probably Russians, right? Or, but they can't. The stories are boring. Nobody cares, and also the industry itself is remarkably popular, as I showed in the polling data, right? So there seems to be an absence of urgency. Now, I've asked people in government before, would you like to see a little more anxiety on these issues? Because maybe you would get a little more attention and you could get a little more traction. But I'm not sure that the cyber sector is quite there, that they want that kind of traction. So I think there's a reluctance even among the experts to get more light on this area. I will say Public Safety Canada has also staffed up a lot on cyber. There's no question that I think on the expert side, people worry that it's the public that's far behind. The other, but there are some interesting stories of IT failures. Like we look at the Canada Revenue Agency software defect, when the Canada Revenue Agency uploaded a software defect, or a software, and it was defective, and they knew within minutes that it was defective, and they had to take all their systems offline, and they were unable to collect or disseminate cash at CRA online as a result of this. Major event. But we looked at that case, and that was in our media coverage. I mean, maybe 6 or 7 stories in the Globe and Mail, and yet, from an operational standpoint, it was huge and devastating in terms of the government's ability to actually do business. And I'm sure CRA thought it got a lot of media coverage. It did get more coverage than CRA typically gets. But I kind of felt like some people were sort of secretly hoping, because it happened at tax time, that maybe we weren't going to have to file our taxes this year, right? Instead of thinking, actually, this is very debilitating for the government. There are several examples where there have been significant disruption to governments, their ability to perform basic functions because their IT has been disabled from intruders. It does not resonate with the public. It does concern experts, I think, a lot. But it's a complicated problem. The one other point I'll make on this issue is this. So we actually have done a lot on cyber in terms of how we talk about it and argue about it. One of the things about risk is if you can identify a vulnerable population, you get a lot more attention. And cyber can't really identify vulnerable populations very easily. However, when you think about issues like cyberbullying and children being abused online, that kind of stuff gets tons of attention right away. Political attention, newspaper attention, it drives a lot of stuff. But something like, credit card fraud doesn't, even though the credit card fraud funding from that could be used to abuse vulnerable populations. So in some ways, I almost wonder sometimes, like, we have to kind of use some of the issues that get more attention to start making people more aware of the vulnerabilities that exist online, and perhaps inch our way towards some more regulation, some smart regulation on cyber, because a lot of the space is unregulated and we depend on it very, very significantly. If we were to roll the clock back 10 years, I wrote a book about Y2K. There was an incredible lack of awareness of our dependence on IT systems 10 years ago. I think the space has actually become more complex now, not less complex. Anyway, I could go on, I won't, but I think that's...
I think we'll move on to the next question. Yeah. I know you folk probably have things, but just in the interest of time. Cecilia Kamate.
Hello, thank you for the discussion so far. My name is Cecilia, I'm an MPA candidate. My question is for Mr. Henstra. How would you suggest we make collaborative response to emergencies affecting critical infrastructure work in the face of departmental tough wars and competing interests?
Yes. Well, collaboration is the key. In fact, it's the only solution, because the expertise is so distributed among departments and among private sector actors as well. But that means continuous contact between these officials to build trust, to build these strong working relationships, and exercises to simulate, in real time, an event, a critical infrastructure failure, and to test out how plans work and to go through all of the motions in a genuine way to be able to identify weaknesses in the response chain, and then to report on those and to make sure that there's follow-up afterward to make sure that those weaknesses are addressed. That's the main way, and that has worked quite well in emergency management. We in this country do response very well to emergencies, but anticipating things ahead of time and then preventing them is where we're not so strong. So I think that's what it would require.
Anything to add? Anything to add?
No, not particularly. I think but it comes back to the last question as well, where you can say, can government trust delegating cyber stuff to private companies, but you need the collaboration for the same reasons. The government can't have a huge infrastructure, can have some oversight. The companies have that, and you got to trust the companies, but you got to work really closely. Yeah. And so I don't want to go back too much to that question, but it's really the same issue. You really need these multi-sector and multi-agency collaborations to make it work.
Audra White.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Audra. I'm in my first year of resource and environmental management. This question is just for the panel, whoever wants to answer. It's how do you shift public perceptions on failure so that industries and even governments can improve their capacity for adaptive learning, which is often considered like a safe to fail approach and crucial to resilience? So if you could speak to that.
Sure, I can take that. Well, it's very difficult, of course, because no one wants to take the blame in these types of cases. But it means having a discussion with the public, or engaging the public in a non-emergency situation, because the problem is it's in the disaster aftermath that we have that it enters the public consciousness, and they, like others, are looking for who to blame and looking for the root causes of failure and that sort of thing. But really, learning from these events sometimes requires systematic study, like a royal commission or some other, or maybe not a royal commission, but at least an inquiry, a formal inquiry, the results of which would be made public and digestible for a general consumption, so that it's in plain language, like the key highlights are in plain language. This is what we learned. This is what we should do differently next time, and this is how we're going to do better moving forward. That's what I think.
Well, I could say it's a bit of a paradox, because I like that word today, but what I mean by that is I'm not sure we want to be constantly trying to educate the public to make the pressure, to make the changes, and I don't mean it should be secret. Kevin's book talks a lot about better transparency, more websites, more reports, follow-ups. That's not what I mean. What I mean is I don't think it'll happen because the public's all hyped up about critical infrastructure, because I just don't ever think that's going to happen. It's too diffuse, it's too unclear, they're not interested enough, which was brought up earlier. So we do want to get the public more informed, but I think it's the government, as the representatives of the public, saying, these things can go wrong, and I'm sure the public doesn't want them to go wrong. Let's keep putting the resources in the best place possible, which is a difficult question, because you can't deal with all the risks equally. So I think the better awareness by the public is important, but I think it's more of getting the government to put it on their agenda and keep it on their agenda more generally. So that answers your question.
I might add a few thoughts on this and say that one of the things that we're kind of confronted with in public administration is the value and stability of bureaucracy. So we love bureaucracy because the accountability is clear, the organization is remarkably stable. I mean, I always, sort of think it's amazing to think that an elected government can fall. If you're like in a minority government, an elected government can fall, and the public service will still keep chugging along. Like at a certain point, it kind of runs out of steam without some democratic leadership. But it's remarkable that we have this very stable system. But it's very hard to be stable and adaptive at the same time. To say we want routines, we want rules and regulations, we want bureaucratic accountability, but we also want you to be incredibly dynamic and flexible and whatnot, and adapt as the wind blows. So I think that's a challenge for bureaucracy. So we value the stability. It's hard to imagine embedding the stability and the resilience at the same time. I think it's also, and the more we get into this dynamic of shared responsibility, the more it obscures accountability. And this is the bigger threat, I think, that we don't actually know who's responsible for what around here. And the interdependence of these models are so complex, the interdependence of the infrastructure is so complex. So what ends up happening is the people who are responsible will revert into a defensive mode, as Dan pointed out, more about blame management than anything, and we certainly saw lots of evidence of that. So that's a problem, because we're really living in a kind of post-privatized world. We're not going back. Post-1990, a lot of privatizations occurred, in this country and a lot of other countries, but there's a remarkable blame-shifting dynamic that occurs after these events take place, and then it reverts to the law and to courts, and it takes a long time. It gets quite slow. I guess in terms of, how do you get the public to go along with you on this? Well, the one point I made about cyber is like trying to connect with things that are relevant to them. So when they see vulnerable populations being affected, you can sort of say, yeah, this is because of a lack of online security. So why don't you try to extend that thinking into other areas? And I suspect that, schools and whatnot will probably have kids thinking more and more about online security, so that 20 years from now they'll probably be a bit more adept at it. But in terms of more immediate measures, I totally agree with what everybody else has said in terms of accountability, audits, report, transparency. I'm all about that. That's great. But I'm reminded of Barack Obama's chief of staff saying, don't let a good disaster go to waste. When something goes wrong, that's one thing. The bureaucracy is focused because the media is focused, the politicians are focused. I often say to students, if you want to know what briefing material the minister's office is reading, pick up the newspaper. That's the material, and you have access to the same briefing material. You pick up the newspaper, you know what they're concerned about. So in some ways, the strategic public servant, we think about Mark Moore's book, is compiling evidence of changes that have to happen. And then when disasters happen and the policy window opens, you have to be ready to go. You have to have your arguments lined up. You have to be on top of your file so that you can move it when the media is focused, when all the attention is there, because that window is going to close, and then the bureaucracy is going to fall back into its stable self, and it's not going to move again for a long time. So timing's everything, right? When the bureaucracy is marching, ride with it, but you've got to be ready, which is why you have to be on top of your files. To all my public policy students, you've got to be on top of your files. This is
a lesson that's very much on the radar of both industry, who know when to and how to pressure governments at the right times in their interest, but also on the part of, for example, NGOs who try to exercise, but with considerable fewer resources, the same kind of leverage. And lastly, Odessa Stewart.
My name is Odessa Stewart, and I'm a first-year MPA student. My question is for all the panel members. In looking at the role of effective collaboration in regards to accountability issues, as previously mentioned, trust and transparency of the Canadian government, of those three aspects, which might be the most crucial to improve or be more forthright with to progress risk management procedures and views to the public?
Can you repeat the three? It's collaboration, accountability?
Yeah, effective collaboration in regards to accountability, trust, and transparency.
What's the most important? I can have the first go at it. Yeah. Okay. I refuse to answer because that's the, a collaborative model. I think one of the things. The foundation of our system is accountable government. It's hard for me to stray. I'm a bit of an old sentimental in that way. It's hard for me to get too far away from holding people to account in whatever way to an elected body for the resources we spend, for this management strategy we take. So in some ways, these documents that Dan referred to also is a kind of pushing responsibility out and away from the legislature and into these fora that are not democratically elected. And this is what concerns me a little bit about government playing this sort of partnership role, which it seems to be playing regularly, not in this field, but the word partnership gets used in so many different policy areas, as Dan pointed out. And that concerns me a little bit because the road has to go back to elected government. I think that's very important. So, I mean, for me, the foundation of the system is accountability to an elected body. I think that's crucial. So I think that's always got to be the trump card. The problem with a collaboration model, I mean, it's all the rage to talk about collaboration, but part of the problem with the models that we can get into is we do slip into an absence, like a buddy system, where there's an absence of clarity and transparency. Now, I will say that we probably do have to be mindful that we have to create safe spaces for people to share information about safety and security. I think it would be naive to think that owners and operators of critical infrastructure can't have a frank discussion about vulnerabilities that they're facing, and they exist in a media culture. And if you have a press conference to say that you've got a lot of vulnerabilities with your system, I mean, it could be devastating in terms of the lack of public confidence in the infrastructure. So we do have to create a space for these kinds of conversations and that kind of collaboration and information sharing. But they're not the most transparent, so I think we do have to put some constraints and parameters on it. And one last point on the trust and transparency, and I mean, I spend a lot of time thinking about trust and transparency in this book. You know, what kind of trust are we talking about? The trust literature, by the way, is fascinating literature about different ways to think about trust. But once you start, the problem with this field is once you start talking about trust to keep a secret, it kind of overturns the apple cart in a way. Because once we start saying there's some things we can talk about and some things we can't, it undermines our ability to actually trust one another. Because we're not really putting everything on the table. And this field is filled with not putting everything on the table. About some things you can talk about, some things you can't. So it's hard, actually, to achieve trust. And I'd also pick up on Dan's point earlier that these meetings happen irregularly and like sporadically, even if it's like a couple times a year or whatever, and then the staff change. Like, what kind of trust really would develop in that context if you're thinking about trust between people? So I think the trust one is hard to get at anyway. I think information sharing, maybe a certain barometer of trust, but I think it's quite constrained. So I would say accountability, some space for safe space for collaboration. Trust is hard to pull off.
Well, I was going to actually I was just going to focus on the word trust. Kevin pointed out in his book that the meaning of trust is wide-ranging, and whether we're talking about between collaborators or between sectors. But I think overriding all this is trust of the public, trust by the public of the government. Because it's moderately, it's medium here, lower in other countries. But the point is they are going to drive this agenda. Critical infrastructure needs the experts, needs the sectors, but it can't be single sectors for most of it, especially for the big stuff, because they're all interdependent. Electricity goes down, then whatever, the water may go down, depends if they have backup systems, and there are all kinds of interdependencies. So the reason I think trust trumps the others, if you just ask me to pick, is because hopefully the government's doing it. And I don't mean blind trust, I mean real trust. So how do you find out if it's blind trust? Because if you keep having failures and they keep saying, oh no, we didn't know about that, we didn't deal with that, we didn't tell anybody, then you say, okay, now there's no reason to trust it. But actually there's a lot of it right now that's being managed very well. We don't know about it because it's not falling apart. So you can't have blind trust, but if you have good trust, the government's really doing their job the best they can, and as Kevin said, maybe public safety really raised their game after this auditing report. You don't need the transparency so much, right? Because maybe they're hiding stuff, but if they're really doing their job, why are they hiding stuff? And collaboration is just a mechanism to make it work better. So in the sense, we have to kind of put our hope in the government and keep, oversight and keep asking them questions and ask them to publish more reports and have the NGOs after them. I don't mean just leave them alone, but I think you pretty much have to trust them to move this agenda along. That's my take.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the floor? We have about 4 minutes left, so anyone who has a quick, articulate question? Sir.
Yeah, so I'm thinking about two different sorts of unpredictable events, but one of which is more predictable than the other. And I'm wondering if they're treated differently. So there are some events which are pure black swans, and they appear to come out of nowhere. Others we know are going to happen. I would use a Vancouver earthquake. as an example. So are those treated differently and better, in your opinion?
Thank you. Do you want to?
Sure, yeah. I would say that it is true. There are, fundamental differences between these types of events, and that the second case we know is going to happen, but not when. In Vancouver in particular, there are people working on these types of scenarios and thinking things through. I know, more than 10 years ago now when I lived in Vancouver, it was how to deal with buildings that have unreinforced masonry. They're brick buildings, but it hasn't been enforced, and with seismic standards that are in place now, how to deal with them. There's something like 15,000 of these buildings around the city, very expensive to replace the brick. And so it's a slow process. First you have to identify them, then you have to assess the risk, then you have to find some way to co-finance the dealing with it. So those types of events are more manageable in the sense that we can at least plan ahead some things that are headed for. But in some circles, knowing that they're going to happen someday isn't necessarily very comforting. In the insurance circles, for example, the horror scenario is a simultaneous earthquake in Montreal or Vancouver plus a major flood somewhere else, where we could see whole companies go bankrupt. But in dealing with the other, it's thinking through possible scenarios, and there is some value to the permeating of the concept of resilience, that we don't really know what the shock or stress is going to be, but we can put measures in place to try to be nimble and adaptive and ready for these types of shocks, no matter what they are. Since there's a lot of uncertainty, my area in climate change sees this in particular. It's not just uncertainty, but ambiguity. We just don't really know what kind of risks we're going to face into the future, except for more of what we're already seeing. So resilience is thinking through how can we ensure that we have plans in place, but also that we've exercised different types of scenarios to make sure that we're working together well, no matter what the pressure is going to be. That's
You have a final quick question.
I have a question, yeah. Microphone forward, okay. So it's for Dr. Quigley. You were talking about post-privatization, and so a lot of formerly public utilities were publicly held or now privatized. Is that detrimental to risk management, since you have the expertise in the private sector, and there's a sort of a conflict of interest in that sometimes managing risk is costly, and therefore private companies may not want to put the same costs as
Right.
non-profit driven.
So the question, I'll just repeat the question, is whether the private sector, it makes a difference that the critical assets have been largely outsourced, et cetera. A couple of points. I think one is that it's probably not so easy to talk about as being public or private. It's a bit of a mess, right? The transportation sector, there's just so many different ownership models. The government is involved in some indirectly, they lease things and whatnot, so it's a kind of complicated mess about who owns the infrastructure. Typically you see people saying, well, 80% of the infrastructure is owned by the private sector. There's certainly a lot of private sector pressure there and market dynamics, what's going on, but just to complicate it to start, to say government still plays a role in a lot of these national assets. And the very fact that it is critical infrastructure, as we point out in the book, means the government's interested, right? If it's a critical asset, the government's at your door whether you want them to be or not. But anyway, that said, I think it's an easy one to say, private sector pressures, keep the costs down, cut the costs, and this will increase risk. I think that is probably true. And I think there's no doubt that there's a certain amount of pressure to keep the costs down. But I would say in the book that we held back on making that, because the thing about the public sector is often they're monopoly service providers, and they can control their own information a lot better than, say, small private companies can. And so I'm not sure a big publicly owned asset is any more concerned than a private company for the same reasons about failure. If you're managing critical infrastructure, you're concerned about a failure, and therefore you get into the same problem of discussing vulnerabilities, making information available about vulnerabilities, I think that would be difficult for the public sector and the private sector. I think the key point is that market pressure is going to keep private industry their feet to the fire, and that will open up some vulnerabilities. But I just wouldn't want to overstate that case and say that privatization somehow has caused, I think it's changed the risk profile to a certain degree. But I mean, from a public administration standpoint, when you're looking at monopoly service providers, they often have a much better handle on their information. And if they can control their information, it's harder for the public to know about the vulnerabilities they have. So I think there's a problem there too in the public sector, possibly.
So we've run out of time, and I'm glad that Professor Henstra ended by mentioning something about resilience, because resilience is of the three concepts for today that we were meant to think about: risk, resilience, and critical infrastructure. Resilience is the one that got the least direct attention, at least explicit treatment. And so resilience is, of course, something that can be thought about relative to keeping things as they are, status quo, and resilience can also, particularly in changing circumstances, be thought of something that is the opposite, adaptive, evolutionary, and this is something to be thrown at. And my last thought is just about transportation. It will be very interesting to see how all of this will play out, and the insights of Dr. Quigley and his collaborators' book will play out relative to the question of automated vehicles. What is a personal transport going to look like in the domain 10 years from now, 15 years from now, of automated transport? Please join me in thanking Dr. Quigley, his co-authors, and our panelists for today. And special thanks to Katie Powell, who helped us out with the practicalities of today's event as well. And thank you.